Well, so Eric, it's almost impossible to figure out where to start, especially with this sort of map in the number of things that we could talk about. But I think that the first thing we talk about is how much news there's been recently about potentially a new device coming out from Google and a new version of your...
We don't make devices.
A new operating system aligned with a potential hardware device coming from Google. We'd love to see it, if that were possible.
So how about instead a demonstration of some software?
Okay.
Okay. So I happen to have here an unannounced product that I carry around with me. That is an Android.
Is that the device?
It's an unannounced device that I carry around with me.
It's actually a pretty cool look.
Look, we have a camera here so you guys can see it.
And you'll notice that we've cleverly taped over its origin. Okay. Well, in any case, so you turn this thing on. The reason I wanted to bring this is that this is a place mark. Everybody recognizes the usual place mark. And so the neat thing that you can do, there's this new technology called NFC, which stands for Near Field Communication. And we think actually that Android devices should support this. It's been around for a while, by the way. And what you do is these are chips that are embedded in things and eventually enclosed to prevent people from stealing them and that kind of stuff. And they're senders. But we're incorporating support for the reader-writer. So the way it works is you turn this thing on and so forth. And you basically just tap like that. And it tells you, in this particular case, where you are. So if I basically go like that, it'll find us here at the palace. So what's neat about the NFC chips is that the whole notion of location takes on a new meaning, right? Because now I can just tap. I don't have to take a picture. I don't have to scan a barcode or what have you. And we're waiting for the network.
So this is basically going to be in presumably many of the newer Android phones.
It's going to actually be in the new operating system called Gingerbread that comes out in like the next few weeks.
Right.
And so we think that the overall mobile market, which is already extraordinarily excited about these payment systems, will benefit from having this because it's a secure element. And the secure element really is very hard to steal, if you will.
So a secure element basically allows you to do payment.
So one way to think about this is this could replace your credit card. And so the term of the industry is called tap and pay. And by the way, I was just saying. But basically, it was just showing the definition, the Google information about.
Maybe we should take this away so that you don't keep triggering it.
Oh, that's right. But
who knows what you're buying?
Here you have
the Palace
definition.
Hotel. Right.
So from here you can then say, well, here I am. And so the theory of the case is that you'll be able to take these mobile devices from everybody, and you'll be able to walk into stores, right, and do commerce. You'll be able to figure out where you are, right, because and again, with your permission and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Effectively, bump for everything.
Yeah, bump for everything. Yeah. And eventually replace literally credit cards.
So it also turns the phone into a much more powerful form of identification.
It's an example of what I've talked about for a while, which is sort of mobile first.
Yeah.
That I don't think people understood how much more powerful these mobile devices were going to be than the desktops. You think of the desktop machine as having all of this power and this sort of tremendous network and beautiful screen. But because these things are so highly personal and because they're location aware.
And they're so highly networked.
Absolutely, highly networked. Yeah. Highly networked now with LTE coming out in the United States, first for a change in the world, starting roughly January, February around the country. It's a really, really good day for mobile.
Yeah. With the theme of points of control, it strikes us that one of the points of control is having tons and tons of credit card numbers. Amazon has tons, PayPal has tons, Apple has a lot. Combined with this kind of technology, it strikes me it could possibly change the game. Do you agree with that, and where does Google stand with that?
Well, we see ourselves as a technology provider in this. We're not trying to sort of compete in those spaces. But ultimately, this technology is personal, it's secure, and it's an aggregating technology. So it makes sense that you'd put everything in it and then carry it around, right? And it has to be secure because it's obviously would be used as a money replacement.
But still, if you are doing payment, somebody's doing the payment processing.
Yeah, but there are industrial partners for all of the initiatives in the industry of very, very sophisticated payment processors and all the regulations and so
you expect to be partnering there rather than...
Absolutely.
Yeah. You don't... So, but you do have Google Checkout. And so,
well, Google Checkout is is just a piece of this.
Yeah.
Payment processors do something different. They actually dealing with the merchants, moving the money around, dealing with fraud, so forth. The reason this NFC chip is so interesting is because the credit card industry thinks that the loss rate is going to be much better. They're just fundamentally more secure. So, and ultimately the money that I think brings us all to this wonderful venue comes out of commerce in one kind or another. Advertising in Google's case. My guess is that there will be 500 new startups in the mobile payment space as these platforms emerge, because there'll be new and interesting things that we can do.
One of the things that I've been fascinated by is the idea that this is going to change, it's going to shorten the loop between search and acquisition of a product. Right now, we see this in buying an app. You search for it and then you buy it on the phone. But this really makes that possible in the real world. You can search for something.
But forget search, right? So we're in the search business.
Yeah, that's
shouldn't really say that.
That's so last year.
In the new world, you have to actually label jokes, right? You can't just sort of say them. That was a joke. Yeah. Okay, so in any case, imagine I'm walking down the street, and instead of typing my search, my phone is giving me information all the time, and it happens to know that I need new pants or something like that, so forth. You can imagine all sorts of linkages between autonomous search and location-based search, where you are, where your stores are, what your preferences are, again, if you opt into these situations. And it is likely to drive a very, very large mobile business and mobile e-commerce business. Right. And the scale of commerce is $14 trillion, which is the global GDP. Yeah. And so some large amount of money is to be gotten into these new platforms over time.
And you can really see, for example, how this would be a fabulous tie with something like Groupon. Because it tells you that there's a crowdsourced offer.
And again, if you look at Groupon as a very good example of a very, very successful local merchant, they today use email, right, as their primary acquisition mechanism, but you can imagine there are others. They have competitors who are using other techniques. What we know is people like a deal.
Yeah. Just one last question on Android. What are you dissatisfied about with regard to the platform? Like, what do you think needs to be fixed, if anything?
Well, if you score Android against the sort of historic leader in the space, which is the iPhone, and I do this as a proud former board member of the Apple board.
I was going to ask you about that.
Well, former member. There's a set of things that the iPhone really did a brilliant job of bringing out in a closed system. Brilliant design, the App Store, the platform, and so forth and so on. So most people judge Android by how we are doing relative to that. And it's clear that from a reach, choice, and so forth, we're in great shape. The next real focus is at the applications layer. So I think if I were to be critical, I would have liked to have put more emphasis on the application side and so forth earlier. It's hard because, remember, the applications decision is made based on developers who do it based on volume. So you have to establish volume first, which indeed we think we have done with Android. And all of these plays at the third-party level, and again, I know we have a lot of app developers here in the audience, it's fundamentally about the math of a platform. And so we understand platforms very well, and we think Android will be, if not a leading platform, or not the leading platform, a leading platform.
That brings up a question I've been thinking about. As there are more and more applications, it becomes a search problem to figure out which ones.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Did I hear search?
Yes, exactly.
That's right.
And clearly that's your sweet spot, but you don't have some of the same mechanisms for identifying the best apps. How are you thinking about search as a competitive advantage as the application space grows? The App Store is or the Android market is effectively the Google of the app search space.
But we don't think of it as a competitive advantage. We just try to sort of do it better. And the competitive environment will lay us out. And as a comment, I think people are obsessed about the competitive landscape when what they should really be focusing is how much bigger the market is getting. And because of including the leadership that you guys did with Web 2.0, so many years ago, this is a very large universe that's getting very large, much larger very quickly, bringing more and more people into it. And so while the competition is healthy, what's really happening is you're growing the market. So with respect to the applications and application search, there's all sorts of interesting ways of doing that. AdMob, for example, is doing on the order of 1 billion ad impressions a day now. It's unbelievable. Give the scale of the mobile opportunity. AdMob, a very successful acquisition on Google's part.
Yeah, you see mobile apps
and that kind of information, in theory, right, is useful as part of a search problem because ads have real value, and we really believe that.
Yeah, I think people have underweighted advertising.
There are many, many ways in which the kind of information that people are using in the usage pattern, can be used to actually provide better choices. But you're correct that these markets tend to sort of overcorrect. They have millions of apps or whatever, but then ultimately the leaders emerge.
Yeah, one of the things that I think maybe Steve and Apple did right, or I'd like your comment on this because you mentioned the design and the App Store. But what about almost the divorce from the carriers? The ability to pretty much set your own business terms and say, I don't want your stuff on my phone.
Well,
and do you think that Android's ever going to be truly free of that?
Well, I certainly hope so, in the sense that the Android model is different from the Apple model very distinctly on sort of pretty much every point, right, in terms of choices and opportunities. And it's open systems versus closed systems, and closed systems have their advantages, and open systems have their advantages. Google made a bet in its founding and the years I've been associated with it, and making another bet on open systems. We're willing to let the carriers and the vendors and so forth set their pricing, set their distribution terms, and so forth. We think that's the right model.
When you discontinued this store and the Nexus 1, did you do that forever? Or is there a point at which you
I said there would never be a Nexus 2.
But an S, perhaps.
I said 2.
All right, we'll move on to another subject.
You notice the similarity,
so much to cover here.
Similarity between an S and a 2.
Yeah, that's right, dyslexic.
That's right.
Recently, there was a big story, and a fellow lost his job over this story, understandably, I would presume, for disclosing it, that you were giving a raise to everybody at Google, and that's been confirmed. Can you talk a bit about the environment that we're in right now for talent and how you came to this decision?
Well, the origins of the raise were later in the spring, so about 6 months ago, when we were looking at our forward revenue, and we realized that looked like we're still sort of carrying the memories of the recession, right? What do we have to do, and so forth. And so we made a series of decisions at the time, one of which was to significantly invest in the core parts of our business, core advertising, core search. As a result of that investment, for example, you saw Google Instant came out, which has been hugely successful. The advertising products, the success in our display business. Indeed, we've now come along to a view which we call hockey stick, where we're looking for these hockey sticks in these products, and we just pour resources onto them. Another thing that we made a decision to do at the time was to focus on even more acquisitions. We did a sort of review of the acquisition strategies and how well they had worked for us. Android, for example, came in as an acquisition. Yeah. The Maps came in as an acquisition. I'm going to give you an example after example. Something about the crucible of acquisitions and startups that produces these gems, which we can then acquire for a modest fee in hindsight and then grow them very quickly. And then the third one had to do with sort of sharing the success of the company with the employees. And we did a series of surveys with the employees who basically are having trouble, even at the wealth that's been created at Google, dealing with sky-high property prices, mortgages, and those kinds of things. And high tech is in something of a bubble relative to the rest of the country. It's pretty bleak out there in the United States. And high tech, at least especially in the advertising and ads, has been largely exempted from this. So it is a war for talent. And so this is a component of that. Although the primary motivation, if it were just about that, we would have targeted specific groups. We just thought it was good for the whole company, because we could.
I imagine it was a happy day when the
very nice day. Very nice day when everybody's getting
people were grinning.
And we did it globally, by the way, around the whole company.
Yeah, and you did it global. That's interesting.
Every single employee.
Now, you mentioned this crucible, and I think that almost everybody out in the audience is involved in some aspect of that company creation, and Tim and I are as well. But there have been some observers have said that oftentimes folks who come from that crucible that then go to work at a company like Google, and it's not unique to just Google, can't get what they want to get done, and they leave. And they go because they want to go start another company. And a few years ago, you started the Founders Program to try to encourage sort of startups inside of Google, startup mentality inside of Google. Is this a concern of yours, or do you consider that just part of the ecosystem?
Well, these things are always a concern for an executive in our industry. And the fact of the matter is people move around a lot. Our aggregate what is called regretted attrition has not changed in 7 years. Mm-hmm. So media stories are just fundamentally wrong on that.
Yeah, one high-profile person goes, and it's a movement.
And so, we hire a couple hundred people a week, kind of numbers. So again, there's a selection bias. It's just poor story writing, in my view. Any company of scale is subject to the following narrative: big, fat, dumb, and happy, right? And if you look at the history of Silicon Valley, all of the companies sort of face this question. So how do we answer this question at Google? Well, we have lots of autonomous units that try to do things. The company is fundamentally decentralized. The decision-making is made pretty low level. The 20% time solutions, the 70-20-10. So we're less likely to be affected by this narrative than most companies, which are much more command and control. The command and control would bring us some benefits of more control, but it would increase the likelihood of people sort of saying, well, hey, I'm out of here.
Right.
And I think in the evidence so far in talking to our employees and so forth is people are ecstatic to work at Google, and people are dying to come to work here.
Yeah. But back to M&A, you have had some incredible successes with acquisitions. You've also had some notable failures. I think every company does.
And we celebrate the failures. We understand that we're not going to be 100%. We did a scoring pretty thoroughly, and virtually all of our acquisitions have had a pretty significant impact on the company, either in terms of brands that they brought in, products they brought in, or simply talent. If you trace where the talent ended up, they stayed, and they ended up doing interesting things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I might ask you a question that is predicated on one of those times when you wish you had the joke tag. Mm-hmm. But Google has been in some hot water with various regulatory agencies, Canada, Spain, Germany, over the last few months. And in some responses to them, you said, look, our job is to push it up to the creepy line and not cross it. Yeah. Can you unpack that so that maybe it's understood?
This, again, is an example of a quote that's being used.
I'm giving you an opportunity to contextualize.
What's interesting is that my whole strategy was to force everything onto YouTube because people have to actually watch it. Right, but now even that's
not because you want it, just because you want people to watch it.
Well, it would be self-serving. Of course, we want people to use YouTube, which, by the way, has 35 hours of video uploaded every minute. A truly amazing
more than the last time I heard that.
And disturbing statistic, I think. So it shows you the success. The term that I was referring to is that there is clearly a line that we should not cross. Classic example here is face recognition. It is technically possible to do face recognition live, real time. Right?
And people will eventually come to accept that. They will want it, I believe.
That is your political view, and do not quote me as having said that.
No, I understand.
Trust me. Trust me.
I understand.
That is not a no-brainer. There are many people who agree with you, and there's a whole bunch of people, including people in charge of a whole bunch of governments, who strongly disagree with you.
Yeah, all right. I will certainly
So
agree
face
with
recognition is an example because of some of the negative effects that are obvious and are clearly not desirable.
Yeah,
right. There are many, many such examples where the technology will allow real-time tracking, another example. We have a rule about Google Maps and Google Earth that we don't show images that are real-time, because we don't want them to be used to track things. So these are examples of a line that we've decided not to cross. So that was what I was trying to express.
Right.
So is your autonomous vehicle, where does that go on that line?
Give an example of how crazy this thing is. There are on the order of 30,000 people terribly killed in America on the highways this year. The number has been relatively stable with traffic improvements and growth in society. It's obvious to me that if the car had buggy software and you were drunk, it would still be better for the buggy software to drive you home than you, right? So just think about it. Now, we would never in our society...
It might be better just to not get in the car.
Well, again, if we could figure out a way to do that, I guess
right.
we'd discuss that. But the fact of the matter is you're fundamentally be better off with at least a driver helper. So the insight that we had a long time ago is we can build these driver helpers. Yeah. And the way the autonomous cars work is, of course, there's a big red button. And the driver, by the way, is in the driver's seat. Okay. We're not suggesting the car drives without the driver present. And we're quite convinced that this is legal under current laws.
Right.
So
and back to face recognition, obviously identifying somebody is one thing, but you could also, for example, notice that they're dozing off in your autonomous car.
You're still working on the face recognition agenda, trust me. It seems to me, yes, you could. And there are other ways that you could do that, like having your friend prevent you from getting in the car, or having a keypad that you have, solve some algebraic equation before you get in your car.
You clearly don't want to go there.
Well, I'm just curious about, I agree that this idea of the line makes sort of intellectual sense, and I think everyone gets it. But as you point out, everybody has a different line.
Yeah, I was going to say is that what we have learned is that people disagree on where that line is, and it's not up for Google to make that decision. And what's happening is the technology that all of us are involved with are bringing questions that really didn't have to be answered before to be formed. In Google's case, information that was public but not broadly known is now broadly knowable because of search engines, and we understand that. It was public information, but a relatively small number of people did it. The other companies have similar sort of narratives.
Facebook, for example.
And again, you guys can talk about those examples. But the fact of the matter is society is going to have to confront all sorts of uncomfortable questions, right? The line between privacy, security, the need for the police, what police surveillance kinds of questions. Right. All of these questions, and I'll give you an example. That in England, when you walk down, in London, when you walk down the street, you're likely to be on a camera. It's widely accepted in their society as being acceptable. You did that in the United States, it would be completely unacceptable. So there are plenty of examples where the privacy conversation differs. My own view is that this debate is going to get worse, it's going to be harder, because the technology moves forward with the real-time information that can be collected and by the ubiquitous nature of these phones.
But you have to make some decisions as you create products, right? For example, as you were creating the Street View product, you made some decisions about the data that you were collecting. Some of those decisions had implications that perhaps you hadn't considered, and then you recanted those decisions.
What we learned with all of these things is that you just can't rush a product out anymore. That the engineers' political views, for example, are not necessarily what governments will accept, which is historically how the web worked. Street View is a classic example where we started off with face blurring, the omission of certain sensitive sites like battered women's shelters and that sort of thing, and also license plate blurring. And we figured that would be sort of good enough. That was our initial assumption, and everyone agreed to that. But in some countries, that's not good enough. So then we added the ability to delete your house from the images after the drive-by had occurred. And for most countries, that seems to have worked pretty well, and Street View is a hugely successful product. But there's one country where not even that is sufficient, and that's Germany, where there we actually put in prior to driving blur, omission. In other words, we'll drive by and we will never take the picture of your house, which was, and it's a request thing, widely publicized in Germany. Lots and lots of discussion about it. Relatively small number of people actually chose to do it. But it was a reasonable accommodation to the cultural sensitivity. Street View now, people in Germany love Street View. Right? Yeah. So that's, again, I think, how we've had to operate. And my guess is that will be the narrative for privacy for our industry as a whole for a very long time.
So if we could pivot using that framework, how are you thinking about these issues as you develop what has been reported to be Google Meet? I understand, not Facebook answer to Facebook.
Okay, almost none of what you just said are products that I recognize. So maybe you should ask a different question.
I think everyone in the room shares your befuddlement.
Okay,
in other words, let me ask another question.
Ask the question in a different way.
Are you planning a suite or specific set of products around social that are distinct in some way and may, in coming months or years, be seen as competitive to Facebook?
Okay, that's a very good question. First place, I think, again, because of this obsession with competition among the players, everything we do is seen as competitive with everything else.
That's a fair point.
So I would assume under that logic, in the iTunes, the ability to have a social network would be seen as competitive with Facebook if you follow that line of reasoning. So I would rather answer the question by saying that we agree that social information is very important, in particular the name value graphs that are being generated. We think that that link structure has great value, technically and for purposes. And a classic example would be in search, right? We can produce a better search result if, with your permission, right, information that is anonymized about what your friends are doing is made available as one of the many signals that we provide.
Right.
Okay, it seems obvious.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's a deal that Facebook and Microsoft announced a few weeks ago.
Right.
So they obviously, those two companies must agree as well.
But didn't Mark actually comment that one of the reasons they chose Microsoft was that they felt that Google was more of a competitive threat in their space?
I can't speak for Mark. I can only speak for
we'll ask him tomorrow afternoon.
Okay. So I can't, you know, whatever he thinks is what he thinks. But
doesn't make it true, is your point.
your words, not mine. Going back to an example would be in maps, right? It's obviously very interesting because you can know where your friends went, right?
Right.
So you can imagine lots of interesting services that Google could build on those things in the products we already have.
If you just integrated Facebook Connect.
Yes, that would be one technique we could use.
But is there a reason that, like, I know you've done some with that, but you know, in the spirit of what Tim said as we opened, there are clearly business reasons that you're not doing that, right? It's not just for the benefit of the users. It's because you don't want to necessarily strengthen Facebook.
Again, it's not literally how we think. The way we literally think has to do with openness. And
so for the last weeks,
if you think about it, if you go back to your work 20 years ago, right, which you and I worked together a long time ago, on the principles of openness, one of the fundamental principles of the internet is that this kind of information is generally open, is generally available. It's owned by people who can basically move it around. And so I worry, right, just as a generic statement and not as a specific response to Facebook Connect or anything else, that the business structures, and you talked about this in your opening, are causing people to keep too much private information. If you go back to the history of Cisco, for example, 30 years ago, right, we had a proprietary routing protocol that was replaced by an open routing protocol. And yet it still produced an amazingly successful company, which is the leader in its field. So it's possible to build network businesses, which is what all of these businesses are, using completely open protocols.
Right, and to your point, we do have some major players today who are not very webby.
Yeah.
You know, they're not very internet-y in the way that we have grown to know and love. And I think you worry, and I know I certainly worry about the downstream effects when people wake up and find out that they've been owned in some way.
And I think in general, you know, we've taken the position that user data is the users, and it should be possible for them to move it back and forth.
So, to the point that John brought up, the little spat between you and Facebook about Gmail scraping being one way.
Yeah, so indeed, we still allow people to export their contacts.
Right.
If I can try to align, and I think that sometimes, and certainly I'm guilty of this, and I'm the proxy for the audience often, in that I ask, you know, questions that maybe I shouldn't, but they might want to hear. And I think that the question of net neutrality and the question of openness are often sort of mashed together as sort of similar philosophical.
And of course, they're quite different. But
well, right, but this is, given our conversations about mobile and Android, and I'm curious if you can maybe take a minute to educate us on how you came to the joint statement you made with Verizon on the issue of net neutrality, and in particular the idea that, well, on the open wired web, net neutrality means A, and on the wireless web, it means B.
Yeah, which is precisely not what we said. A little bit of background. It's helpful, by the way, to define the terms. So net neutrality has, for Google, for many, many years, and I think for responsible people in the industry, has meant that if you have one data type, video or whatever, the telecommunications vendor won't unfairly penalize their content over the others of the same type. It explicitly allows for discrimination between different types. So you could prioritize video below audio, for example, or SMS or whatever networking decision. And we, Google, have always been in favor of that, and we continue to do so. The telcos, as a general rule, are okay with this if you actually talk to them, because they're not really doing it. And ever since Comcast's experience with BitTorrent, which is sort of a complex narrative, you know, they saw the public reaction to what was essentially a minor example of this problem. where they were doing traffic shaping. So I think everybody understands how sensitive people are on this. So the problem with the telcos as an aggregate, and I'm using cable companies as well, is they don't want to be regulated. And if you talk to them privately, what they'll say is, we're sort of okay with this, but the one thing we do not want is the government writing regulations, because we just left 30 years of regulations. So our idea was to start the process of trying to put an industry agreement together by saying, let's focus on wired. Now, why would you focus on wired? In most cases, the choice you have for a high-quality wired connection consists of one. So it's not as competitive a market as wireless, right? And we figure competition will probably keep wireless under control. And Verizon, to their credit, was willing, in principle, to agree with this as a policy statement. So we jointly announced that the two of us together thought this was a pretty good idea. We did that in order to try to encourage more conversation about this in the industry.
But at the same time, the FCC was really in the middle of an initiative here when they took the wind out of their sails.
I'm not sure I completely agree with that, because we spent a lot of time with the FCC, and indeed the FCC was in a series of meetings which we were in with all of that, and I'm very good, close to the chairman and so forth. So I disagree with that rendition, and that's a different report.
I talked to Julius about that time, and he was a little taken aback.
Okay, well, I did the same.
Well, fortunately, Julius is here, and we can talk to him about that too.
So the effect of this was that unfortunately, election fever took over, and I don't think anything's going to happen until January, February, and probably not then for a while longer.
But there is a core argument that, or at least it came across, I think that's more fair to say, so you can explain, that wireless is different from wired. But yet, we opened this conversation with wireless is extraordinary, important, and distinct, and we need to be very careful.
I wouldn't be too... I wouldn't obsess about this too much. I understand that all of these things matter. What we were only trying to do here was to move the ball a little bit forward. If the ball doesn't move forward because we didn't do it, somebody else needs to move it forward. We were just trying to be helpful. With respect to wireless, the conclusion we came to was that wireless is very, very competitive, which I think is true. Yeah. Right? That doesn't mean, and so if your view is that it should also be regulated, then that's a fine view. But we generally prefer competition to produce the right outcome. Yeah.
But as you said, the principle of net neutrality, as you describe it, just to make sure I understand this, should apply absolutely to wired, but not necessarily to wireless, is how I read it.
We didn't actually say that. What we said was that we could, after lots of arguing with a partner slash foe in the debate, we came to common ground in this area. So our proposal was the wireless stuff you deal with separately, which is not the same thing as what you said.
I want to come back to this. Location is a key part of mobile. And how important is that? You recently moved Marissa Mayer to a new position.
Marissa was actually promoted to do all of the local maps and geographic stuff. And she's a perfect example of a person who sort of crosses between the UI world, consumer world, as well as the underlying infrastructure.
So, but I mean, do you see more and more focus there for you guys?
Absolutely. Right. Google Maps are phenomenal. I mean, I don't know about you all, but for me, Google Earth has sort of changed my appreciation of the world. We're working on technology to allow you to further visualize things within Google Earth. We're investing hundreds of millions of dollars into better imagery, better applications, and so forth on top of that.
No question. I mean, just walking with Google Maps on a phone
it just changes
is a transformative experience. Yeah. You're not lost.
We have so much to cover. We have microphones here for you to please come up, and we'll take a few questions. I want to pivot to yet another part of your business, which is Google TV.
Sure.
Just recently in market. How's it going? And do you think the networks are going to get on board? And what's their beef?
I can't speak for them.
But you know what their beef is.
Well, I've heard it. Simple argument goes something like this. No one has fundamentally unified the internet and television because there were always constraints. The CPUs weren't fast enough, the networks weren't fast enough. So we happen to be at one of these points in time when you can put a chip that's fast enough, and indeed the high-end televisions have fast chips and fast DRAMs, and you can put an operating system conveniently based on Linux, and you can put a browser, conveniently Chrome, so you have Android plus Chrome, and you can put that inside of your television. So what happens is you turn the thing on, and it's a beautiful HD television, and we haven't done anything yet. Press a button, and boom, you're in a browser. Okay, no big deal. It's a full browser. Furthermore, you can now go back and forth between web content and broadcast content. As I understand the industry's concern, one of them said the following: do you realize that you're taking a dumb television and you're making it smart? And I said, yes, we're guilty of that. And the concern is that this enormous revenue stream that's targeted to, quote, dumb televisions is somehow going to be affected negatively by access to all this internet content. I disagree. I think part of the experiment that's being run now with what is obviously a hugely successful product from Sony is people are going to watch more television. Because they're going to watch the broadcast content, and then they're going to go and check things and learn things on the web.
But they may also watch through different companies. You look at what Netflix is doing with streaming, for example, huge impact.
But Netflix is also a significant source of revenue to the broadcast studios and so forth. Right. Netflix pays a pretty penny for all of the rights for that content. Yeah. And they're a good player there and a good partner for us. So I think one way to think about it is, all of a sudden, what do you fundamentally believe will happen with television? Do you think fundamentally people will go to the web to content that's stolen, if you will, or do you think that they'll watch more television and have a richer experience? We believe the latter. The one thing I was going to add about Android is, because it's a full browser on Google TV, you can have a tremendously powerful set of applications. Everyone has missed this. It's a whole new platform play on your television. Television is a big business, guys.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's what they're afraid of.
Yeah. Well, but the platforms could be very interesting. Gaming platforms, immerse yourself into your own television. Lots and lots of new revenue sources in there. I mean, come on, let's think about the creative possibility here.
I think everyone in this room pretty much pro-creativity. I have a sense those who control the current revenue stream into the television through a cable box may be less interested in innovation outside of their model.
Well, again, I'm not trying to speak for them. I'll just observe that the way to get more revenue is to create more revenue sources. And you can do that with things like Google Television.
Yeah. All right, we should get to questions. Over here.
Thanks. Mark Mahaney at Citi. Hey, Eric. You recently disclosed that mobile's a $1 billion revenue run rate. Display advertising's $2.5 billion. It took you 4 or 5 years for both of those, a lot of acquisitions, a lot of internal investments. 3 years from now, what's the next $1 billion incremental revenue opportunity for Google? Is it TV? Is it enterprise apps? Is it Google Me?
Well, the next sort of large revenue, the next large incremental revenue for Google is clearly in the display business. Invite Media, a company we acquired a few months ago, is growing at 10% a month kind of growth rate. It's become the way in which you do your ad insertions. We have, I think we have the largest display ads platform measured by reach of anybody because of the combinations of what we did. The mobile one, of course, is going to be a huge one. What happens after that? Enterprise is clearly one. There are probably very interesting digital goods and commerce kinds of businesses that could be built up on top of the platforms that we've been discussing. Our priority is to get the platform established, get the ecosystem working, and then somehow people will figure out a way to make money. It's just these are too big an audience not to be monetized.
Over here.
Jean-Baptiste Su with l'Expansion in Paris.
Yes, hi, Jean-Baptiste.
Hi, Eric. Just to follow up on John's question. Sorry, I broke my voice. Too much fun this weekend. The networks put out from the Google TV platform, Fox put out, and others. You probably talked to them beforehand, before you launched Google TV. They were on board. What do you think made them, turn the back and
well, again, I think you're adding a little more drama to the question.
I'm a reporter.
Yes, you're a reporter. A whole bunch of people have announced quite publicly that they're happy with what we're doing. And the ones that have reservations, we're trying to address those with data. It makes sense to me that if you haven't had an industry that's had this kind of innovation at scale in a very long time, people would be concerned. This is their livelihood. They do depend on this for revenue, for funding, and so forth. I mean, it's very real. And we don't want to repeat where somehow revenue goes to zero or anything like that. We want to make the revenue larger. So far, the conversations have been friendly, and it'll work itself out. I'm quite confident that we will get through this one, simply because the technology is just so powerful. And we would expect other people besides Sony to enter the market. The software, of course, is free. So it'll be a pretty big market.
Thank you. One more here.
Hey, Mark McKenzie, Alliance Bernstein. Can you give us a little bit of color around the technology approach that you're using for NFC, for one, and then two, the openness of it? So can we expect it to go into a Windows Series 7 phone, an Apple iPhone, and everything else, or do you expect that there will be a format war around that going forward?
As I understand it, the NFC is standardized into two versions: a write-only and then a sort of read-write combination. And I guess there's a read version as well. The chips are used pretty broadly in the industry today. For example, there are credit cards that you can get that have a little wireless symbol, which has the sort of the transmit-only version of this chip. So as far as I know, the standard is pretty well agreed to, and our team is doing the standard that everybody uses. So as far as I know, the industry is not going to fragment, which is be a stupid thing for the industry to do. I can't speak for the other vendors, but I would assume that they would be highly motivated to do the same thing that we're showing today.
We're going to take one more here on this side.
Hi, Arpit from Comcast. The biggest critique that Android faces today is the fragmentation. Like, the iOS is kind of moving in the same direction. More and more of the Mac OS is feeling more like the iOS. Android has been fragmenting, and now with like TV, Android on TV is another interesting platform, although it's like, as a developer, it does give me a lot of confusion. My question is, like, in this world, where does Chrome OS fit in? Like, what's the logic of Chrome OS? Another, like, now I'm confused, like, on a particular size device, is it going to be Chrome? Is it going to be Android?
Actually, a very good question, and let me suggest two separate questions. The first question had to do with fragmentation possibilities of Android. And we use sort of a carrot and stick approach. Basically, the standardization of Android allows people to use the single app store, and everybody needs that app store, and the app store depends upon Android not being fragmented. The stick, of course, is the contracts that are part of the Open Handset Alliance and so forth do not, in fact, allow for the fragmentation. So this charge of fragmentation is a historic fear. I lived through the fragmentation of Unix, which was sort of ultimately, I think, hurt Unix 20 years ago, and you understand this very, very well.
But there are some features that are added for each phone that you can't take out.
Features are not the same thing as fragmentation. Adding value added is great. We want people to add things. But will your app run on this phone from this vendor and this phone from this other vendor? The answer is absolutely yes. In Unix, for example, the answer was absolutely no. And I think that ultimately, so we learned that lesson the hard way. Then you asked the question about Chrome OS. Chrome OS is a very different solution. Chrome OS can be understood as riding on the success of Chrome. And Chrome OS is essentially the Chrome browser running on essentially netbooks of one kind or another, initially Intel chips and ARM chips and so forth and so on. Again, also open, fully open sourced. We don't want to sort of call the question and say this one does one thing, this does the other. So far, the model seems to be that the Android solution is particularly optimized for things that involve touch in some form. And Chrome OS appears to be focusing primarily on keyboard-based solutions that are of the traditional PC variety. And that's how the market seems to be segmenting. And we'll see. Chrome OS is not shipping yet in any volume, so we'll see. And you should be the judge.
We're absolutely going over, and I want to keep going. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to have to cut it off. I'm sorry, but if you don't mind staying a little late.
Hi there, this is Sean Hollister with Engadget. I wanted to ask, you spoke a little bit about where Chrome OS fits. Can you tell us when we'll see it on netbooks, and if we'll see it on tablets?
Well, because it's open source, the answer is yes, 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 and yes, just as you'll see Android on everything. The primary design center, again, has been on netbooks, but of course there's nothing preventing it to be on larger or smaller devices. It's designed around something with a keyboard, though.
But a time frame?
The answer is that the software is coming out in the next few months.
Okay. And then do you have a time frame for Gingerbread? I'll just tack that on the very last bit.
Next few weeks.
Next few weeks. Thank you very much.
Well, Eric, I want to say thank you very much for coming and for submitting yourself to both of our questions today.
I'm glad to be back, and congratulations on a great run, and you have many years ahead.
Thank you.
Join us in thanking Eric for coming.